Hey, what's going on, guys? 018 Set Shadow here. So this time around, instead of a market watch, I'll be having a little chat with you guys in regards to one of the big components of Cardfight Vanguard, which is triggers. Cardfight Vanguard revolves around the use of triggers in a deck. In addition to your normal gameplay, you're checking triggers back and forth, trying to get one-ups over your opponent and additional advantages, and effectively they can sway the game in your favor or steal the game away from you. So when it comes to triggers, historically there have been a lot of interesting factors that have happened over the course of Vanguard's history with them. So since the beginning there have always been 4 types of triggers that were implemented in each game's format. Used to be the critical, the draw, the heal, and the stand, and it eventually changed from stand to front. And then now we have the over trigger, which was introduced with the standard format. And that's where we are brought to today, talking about standard format and where the state of triggers are over here. So there are no stand triggers in the format. We'll just be talking about the current setup, which is going to be crit, draw, front, heal, and the over trigger. Now, of course, there are factors you want to consider when it comes to building decks and also when it comes to buying your triggers when you need to get your decks built out. So there have been lots of things that you hear over chat, over social media, locals, usually a lot of different complaints in regards to either pricing of some of these common triggers that you see in front of you, or just the fact that some triggers just sway the game to a point where you just don't feel good after a loss or maybe even a victory sometimes. And of course there are endless complaints about the over trigger just being too overpowered and defining games the whole way through. So within all of that, what we are going to be looking at today are pricing and deck building. We won't be talking about the triggers individually and won't really be addressing any of those things about the over trigger. But what I just want to talk about are just some trends when it comes to triggers right now. So to start us off, I want to show you what you have in front of you right now, which is a comprehensive list of all the common and trial deck triggers that are currently available for the standard format. In particular, they're critical and heal triggers. And with that in mind, you'll notice that when it comes to the 5 main nations, when it comes to Dragon Empire down to Stoichia, you get up to 4 of each. Brancade and Dragon Empire only have 3 of each, and then Lyrical Melody has 6 different ones that you can make use of. The collab sets, well, Shaman King has a lot of them. I may have even missed one down here for the crits, I'm not sure. But Shaman King has the most out of any of the sets right now. But when you consider the limitations on triggers in standard right now, you can only have up to 8 of crits, fronts, or draws in your deck, then only 4 heals and 1 over trigger. When you consider that, you do have enough vanilla triggers for each nation to be able to play all vanillas to max out either the maximum of your crits or your heals. Despite that, if you've seen my market watches, you've seen price spikes and oddities even on the common level that you would not expect given just how abundant these triggers are supposed to be. And then when you consider the over trigger, there's only one type of over trigger for each nation and each collaboration, and then you've got the generic over trigger over here, which can be used in place of any of them. Even if you see multiple types over here, They're just different artworks, different units, but the same effect. This goes for these as well. So with that in mind, and with the over trigger being at 1, you would think that it would be easy to pick these up in terms of pulling it from a pack or just price. But that's not quite the case. The generic over triggers have been released twice so far for the 5 main nations in set 1 and set 6, and when it comes to lyrical melody, the base rarities have only ever been released in the first set, but the first set has a lot of printings, so these ones tend to be relatively cheap. And then when we go into the effect triggers, currently in the English format, these are the only ones that have reprints right now. The effect crits, fronts, and draws, which come out of sets 2, 3, and 4 respectively, and were all reprinted within set 7. But that's not the case for the lyrical effect triggers, which only came out of their set 2, and even after Festival Collection 2023 comes out, that means there will only be 2 different printings of these in the English format. And the same is stable for the Japanese format too. When you consider the counter heal triggers, the ones from set 5, then Festival 2022, and set 9, and then these 2 from Lyrical set 3, these don't have any reprints at all, and they're a little rarer than these ones are, but because their utility is a lot more specific and niche, they're not played as heavily, which manages to keep their price down. But when it comes to the triggers over here, despite the reprint, these are still pretty expensive when you take a look at a lot of the individual ones on this side. But I want to go back to vanilla triggers and how I talked about my market watches before, where it's wild how when you take a look at this picture and you see that there are crits and heals on the top portion, which all have market prices around 2 or higher, and then listings which are around $2 right now. But then you take a look at the ones on the bottom, which are vanilla front and draw triggers, and they barely breach 25 cents from the market price, which it makes sense when you take a look at the utility of the vanilla draws and fronts versus the vanilla crits and heals. You'll find that every deck, very, very, very few decks are an exception to this, but almost every single deck will always utilize vanilla crits and vanilla heals, but never vanilla fronts or draws. When you can keep that in mind, it makes sense why the prices are like these. And the sad reality is that there isn't much that has been done to make this break this shift. So even with 10 sets now in circulation for standard format, these trends have not broken ever since set 1 came about. To observe some of the trigger ratios that you're going to see in more competitive decks, I've taken a look at the winning team for one of the BSFs that occurred in May this year. And the winning team was comprised of an Eva, Chronojet, and Wellstrip. So, taking a look at the different builds, we're going to take a look at Eva first, and take a look at the triggers. The trigger ratio, starting with the effect triggers, we've got 2 draws, 3 crits, 2 fronts, and the over trigger. Then when we look at vanilla triggers, we have 4 crits and 4 heals. So the overall is 7 crit, 2 draws, 2 fronts, 4 heals, and the over trigger. Then the next one is Chronojet. Let's take a look at this one. We've got, for effect triggers, I see 3 draws, and the over trigger, and there are also 2 counter heals, the crit based one. Then for vanilla triggers, there are 4 crits, 4 crits, 8 crits, and 2 heals. So ultimately the build is 8 crit, 4 heal, 3 draw, and 1 over trigger. Then you've got Wellstra next. If we take a look at triggers for this, starting with effect ones, 4 crit, 3 draw, 1 over trigger. Then for vanillas, there are 4 crits and 4 heals. So the overall deck ratios are 8 crit, 3 draw, 4 heal, and the over trigger. So, sound familiar? Essentially, what we're looking at are 7 to 8 crits per build. Then you've got 4 heals in every build. You've got the over trigger in every build. And then the last few cards are variant. Usually they've been draw triggers, but there are some front triggers. However, all of them are effect based. Which leads me back to my point where when it comes to what triggers you're using in builds, there isn't too much variance. It's almost always going to be crits and heals when it comes to vanilla triggers, and when it comes to effect triggers, you can use almost anything you want, but you're pretty much always going to be trying to max out on crits, or at least get a lot of crits in there so that you have at least 7. It's very rare for a deck to break that ratio. And so that's the whole reason why you'll see higher prices for vanilla crits and vanilla heals, because those get used up in decks all the time, in comparison to draws and fronts where the vanillas are almost nowhere to be seen. When we go back to hopes on pricing and thinking reprints will continue to keep dropping prices, while it's true that we may continue to see drops in prices, the sad reality is that the drops are not going to be enough to keep the prices under $1 all the time. Take for example Festival Collection 2023. Currently I'm looking at a site known as Yuyute, which is a Japanese vendor that dabbles in various card games, and they do Vanguard as well. These are their listings for the common triggers that are getting printed in Festival Collection 2023, and these are all new triggers, by the way. So basically it'll add on an additional crit, draw, front, and heal for each nation, plus lyrical melody in terms of usable triggers. But if you take a look at prices, Dragon Empire, the critical and the heal are 120 yen, while the front and the draw are 50 yen. Dark States, same deal. Crit and heal, 120, front and draw, 50. Then you have Brantgate, same thing. We look at Caters, same thing. And we look at Stoichia, same thing. And Lyrical, also the same thing. So we've seen it from the American vendor perspective, from TCG Player, that vanilla crits and heals always overtake draws and fronts in terms of pricing, and it's no different from the Japanese side. That's a 70 yen difference between the types of triggers. And I say this a lot, but while it's not unexpected, it is pretty wild to see that there just isn't enough support to get players to want to play vanilla draws and fronts on a more consistent basis. Where it would be great if there was, but it takes specific deck types to do that. For instance, the only decks I can see that really might play fronts and draws would be Petrolka, simply because it's a Highlander-based deck. There are a few others, like in set 4, Barrow Magnus would usually play excess draws, and if you found it at the top tables, a lot of them usually just ran those excess vanilla draws. But for the most part, in these formats, that's just not happening. And when it comes to the effect triggers, even with this additional reprint that's coming in Festival Collection 2023, they're still heavily played, and the prices will still continue to stay at relatively high values. They may not be 10 to 20 anymore, but I feel like they will be, at least for some time. But they won't have as many chances to hit the $20 mark on our end with the amount of reprints that we keep getting. We will be getting some more vanilla trigger reprints as we continue to get the additional trial decks, but as more players get into the game, that's going to make it harder and harder for prices to drop. The only way to keep them down in that case is if the player base just doesn't change, or players don't make as many decks as they used to. So, but that's just the thing. Ultimately, the big takeaway points of this whole chat are that trigger ratios are pretty static, and the triggers you're going to use in a deck are pretty much predetermined based off playability. And when it comes to pricing, with every reprint that we can get some dip in price, but it just won't be enough as the player base continues to increase and as players want to build more decks. So unfortunately, it's just pretty static. And with Bushiroad making less product over time because it's getting more expensive, it also adds to the fuel of all of these staple cards continuing to go higher in price. But what do you guys think of this? With everything that I've said, maybe there's silver linings that I just never really paid attention to, or I don't know, hopes that the player base have that I just like to hear sometimes. But what are your thoughts on what I've talked about? Please leave some comments down below. Feel free to set up any chats, and if you liked the video, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys later.